Over a century ago, a ship that was hailed as a true masterpiece of engineering met its end in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. But its story isn't about a single moment of bad luck. No, it's a story about a chain of critical and ultimately fatal errors. So let's get into it.
And right away we run into the central paradox of the Titanic. You have this vessel that was built to be the absolute pinnacle of safety, a floating city made of steel. So how did it just vanish beneath the waves so incredibly fast? Well, the answer lies in a series of 6 fatal mistakes.
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the legend of the unsinkable ship. Then we'll walk through each of the 6 mistakes, from the dangerous race for speed to the ignored warnings, the flaws in its very construction, and finally, the chaotic escape. Then we'll touch on the legacy this tragedy left behind.
To really understand the fall, you first have to appreciate just how high this ship stood in the world's imagination. You see, the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a powerful symbol of progress and ambition.
Just try to picture the scene. 3 years of labor by 2,000 workers had led to this moment. This colossal structure, the biggest ship the world had ever seen, was finally ready. And as it sailed out of Southampton, the excitement was just electric. This was way more than a voyage. It was the dawn of a new age. And this was the promise they sold to the world. The marketing was just relentless, branding the Titanic as unsinkable. And, this wasn't just some catchy slogan. It was a belief, a deeply held belief that reflected just how much confidence the era had in its own technology, a confidence that was about to be completely shattered.
And that brings us to the first mistake, which was made long before the ship ever saw an iceberg. This was a mistake born from pure ambition and the pressures of business.
The captain was under tremendous pressure. See, the goal wasn't simply to get across the Atlantic. It was to do it in a record-setting 7 days. Arriving in New York ahead of schedule would have been a massive PR victory. And what that meant was the ship was pushed to a dangerously high speed right from the start.
So, with the ship racing through the dark, icy waters, its next lines of defense started to completely fall apart. And this time, it wasn't about technology. It was all about human error.
Now, think about this for a second. 6. On that fateful night, the radio room got no fewer than 6 separate warnings about ice fields lying directly in their path. That's 6 chances to slow down, 6 chances to avoid disaster, and every single one of them was missed.
So why? Why were these crucial warnings ignored? Well, for one, the radio operators didn't actually work for the ship's crew. They worked for the Marconi Company, and their main job was sending personal telegrams for the wealthy first-class passengers, which made a lot of money. The critical warnings about ice just got lost in the shuffle. Add that to the whole unsinkable mindset, and the threat just wasn't taken seriously. But the breakdown in communication wasn't even the only failure. There was one last chance, the lookouts, high up in the crow's nest. But they were essentially working blind. You see, the key to the locker where the binoculars were kept had been accidentally left behind in Southampton. Without them, they couldn't spot the iceberg until it was right on top of them. Far, far too late to turn.
All right, let's move on to the 4th mistake. Because even with the collision, the disaster might not have been so catastrophic, if not for a hidden weakness that was forged into the very hull of the ship.
And to understand this flaw, we need to talk for a second about rivets. Now, these are basically small metal pins, and they were the glue holding the Titanic's huge steel plates together. There were millions of them, and their strength was absolutely critical.
But here's the thing, not all the rivets were the same. The main, central part of the ship's hull used high-quality steel rivets, but the bow and the stern, the exact areas that hit the iceberg, were held together with lower-quality wrought iron rivets. They were softer, more brittle, and when the iceberg hit, they couldn't take the pressure. They just popped, one after another, letting the seams split open and the sea pour in.
So now, the ship is sinking. The damage is done. But the loss of life, it could have been so much less. Instead, the final 2 mistakes are what turned a terrible crisis into an unthinkable catastrophe.
Here is the brutal, simple fact. There were not enough lifeboats for everyone on board. I mean, just look at this. You've got about 2,200 people on the Titanic, but there's only enough lifeboat space for about half of them. And what's shocking is that this was actually legal back then. But it guaranteed that if the worst happened, nearly half the people on board were doomed from the very start.
And what makes it even more tragic is that the ship was designed to carry more. It actually had the cranes needed for 32 lifeboats. But To make the first-class decks look more spacious, less cluttered, they cut the number down to just 20. Aesthetics were literally put before safety.
And that brings us to the final, heartbreaking mistake. Because even with so few lifeboats, many more people could have been saved. In the absolute chaos of the evacuation, the lifeboats they did have weren't even filled. A staggering 40% of the available seats were empty as the boats were lowered into the water. The very first lifeboat, for instance, had room for 65 people, but it was launched with only 28. The crew was panicked, afraid the boats might buckle if they were full. The women and children first rule was applied inconsistently, often meaning women and children only, while first-class passengers were given priority, leaving hundreds and hundreds of others behind.
And so the chain of errors was finally complete. The last moments of the Titanic were a truly horrifying testament to the consequences of all these compounded failures.
This timeline really shows you how terrifyingly fast it all happened. From the moment of impact, it took just 2 hours and 40 minutes for the unsinkable ship to be gone forever. Just before the end, the lights flickered and died, plunging everyone into total darkness, before the ship finally broke apart and made its final plunge.
The human cost was just staggering. Around 1,500 people, men, women, and children, lost their lives in the dark and the cold that night. And for those who ended up in the water, there was almost no hope. The ocean temperature was 2 degrees below freezing. In water that cold, survival time is measured in minutes. For most, it was less than half an hour.
So when you look at it all, was the Titanic really a victim of a single iceberg, or was it the victim of a long and tragic chain of human failures? It seems the ship's fate was sealed not by an act of nature, but by arrogance, ambition, and a series of terrible decisions made by people long before it ever touched the ice.